There is something about a lost city that refuses to leave the human imagination alone. It does not matter how much time has passed, how many centuries have settled like dust over the ruins, or how thoroughly the jungle has swallowed the stone. Something in the mind reaches toward the idea of a place that was once full of life, crowded markets, burning torches, the smell of bread and spice and river water, and is now silence. Something pulls at us, the way the tide pulls at the shore. Not violently, but with a kind of insistent, rhythmic longing. Lost cities are not merely archaeological puzzles. They are emotional ones. They ask us a question we are not entirely sure we want answered. What happens when a civilization reaches the height of its power, and then, one day, simply stops? That question has driven explorers into swamps and deserts, up mountain passes where the altitude makes the lungs burn and the vision blur, into archives smelling of old paper and candle wax, into the company of locals whose grandparents remembered things no scholar had thought to write down. It has driven people to obsession, to madness, to glory, and to early graves. And still the cities wait. Some of them have been found, cracked open by archaeology like a geode revealing its crystal interior. Others remain stubborn and hidden, half glimpsed in satellite imagery, or whispered about in indigenous oral tradition, not quite real and not quite myth. All of them, found or not, carry the same quality of suspended breath, the feeling that something was interrupted mid-sentence, and the sentence has never been completed. This is a story about those places. It moves between continents and across millennia, from the high Andes to the Cambodian plains, from the Greek island of Santorini to the salt flats of Bolivia, from the forests of Central America to the shifting sands of the Arabian Peninsula. It is not a story with a single hero or a single mystery. It is a story about humanity's oldest habit, the habit of building something extraordinary and sometimes walking away from it, or being taken away, or simply vanishing in ways that leave the rest of us staring at the stones and asking very quietly, what happened here? The stones, for the most part, do not answer, but they do speak in their way. You just have to know how to listen. Begin in the mountains, because mountains are where several of the most haunting stories start. Specifically, begin in the Andes, in what is now Peru, in a region where the air is thin enough to make a lowlander dizzy, and the light has a particular quality. Sharp and clean and high, as though the sky is closer to the earth here than anywhere else on the planet. This is the landscape of the Inca Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations the Western Hemisphere ever produced, and it is also the landscape of Machu Picchu, which is one of the most recognizable archaeological sites on Earth, while simultaneously remaining one of the most misunderstood. Machu Picchu is not, technically speaking, a lost city. That designation tends to get applied to it because it was unknown to the wider non-indigenous world until 1911, when an American historian named Hiram Bingham III was led to the site by a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga. But Arteaga knew the ruins were there. The local Quechua-speaking population had never lost knowledge of them. What Bingham found was not a place that had been forgotten by everyone. It was a place that had been forgotten by people who had never known about it in the first place, which is a meaningfully different thing. Still, the ruins are genuinely extraordinary, and the questions they raise are genuinely unresolved, and so they belong in this story, not as a cautionary tale about colonialist definitions of discovery, but as an example of how a place can be fully known and completely mysterious at the same time. Machu Picchu sits at approximately 2,430 meters above sea level, tucked into a saddle between two mountain peaks on the eastern slope of the Andes, above the Urubamba River. It was built in the mid-15th century, during the reign of the Inca ruler Pachacuti, who is sometimes described as the Inca equivalent of a pharaoh, and whose name translates roughly to transformer of the world. Pachacuti was not a modest man. He expanded the Inca Empire dramatically during his reign, pushing its borders both north and south, building roads and administrative centers across an enormous geographic area, and commissioning construction projects of a scale and quality that still leave modern engineers quietly impressed. Machu Picchu was one of those projects, and it was completed with a speed and precision that suggests both extraordinary organizational capacity and a workforce that knew exactly what it was doing. The stonework at Machu Picchu is remarkable for several reasons, but the one that tends to stop visitors mid-breath is the joinery. The stones fit together without mortar. They are shaped, and this shaping was done with bronze tools and river stones because the Inca had no iron, to fit one another with a precision that means a thin blade cannot be inserted between them in most places. The walls are slightly inward-leaning, which gives them earthquake resistance. The drainage systems are sophisticated enough that a site receiving significant annual rainfall has remained structurally stable for over 500 years. All of this was accomplished without wheels, without iron, and without written language, at least not in any script that has been deciphered, which is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. The Inca recorded information using something called a quipu, knotted strings whose meaning has not been fully decoded. This means that while we can examine the physical remains of Inca civilization with considerable precision, we cannot read what they wrote to one another. We cannot read their records, their histories, their poetry, their religious texts, their administrative documents. We are, in a very real sense, reading a library that has been translated into a language we do not yet speak. The quipus exist. Thousands of them survive in museums and collections around the world, but the meaning of most of them remains opaque. It is as though someone handed you the complete works of a civilization, and you could see that it was literature, but could not understand a single word. This is the context in which the mystery of Machu Picchu sits. We know when it was built, approximately. We know who built it, approximately. We have a reasonable sense of its layout and its agricultural terracing and its water supply. What we are less certain about is what it was for. Early theories suggested it was a military fortress, which the physical evidence does not particularly support. Later theories proposed it was an estate for the Inca ruler Pachacuti, a kind of royal retreat used during his lifetime and perhaps maintained afterward as a ceremonial center. This theory has more supporting evidence, including the style of the architecture and the apparent distribution of residential and ceremonial spaces. But even this is inference, not certainty. The quipus are not talking. What is certain is that Machu Picchu was abandoned, probably in the early 16th century, and the timing suggests the Spanish invasion had something to do with it, either directly by threatening the region, or indirectly by disrupting the administrative and economic systems that had kept the site functioning. The Spanish, who systematically destroyed much of what they found in the Inca Empire in their hunger for gold and their desire to arise indigenous religion, never found Machu Picchu. The jungle grew over it. The stones settled further into the mountain, and there it waited for roughly 400 years, until Arteaga led Bingham up the slope, and the wider world, astonished, got its first look at what had been hidden in plain sight. Or rather, hidden in altitude, which is a different kind of hiding entirely. The story of Machu Picchu opens the door to a related and perhaps even more tantalizing mystery. The city of Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Inca Empire, where the remnant Inca state held out against the Spanish for nearly 40 years after the fall of Cusco. Vilcabamba was the place where the last Inca rulers maintained a kind of ghost kingdom in the jungle, conducting ceremonies, communicating with the outside world through intermediaries, and launching occasional raids on Spanish settlements. it was a city of defiance, and when the Spanish finally crushed the resistance in 1572 and executed the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru I, Vilcabamba was abandoned to the forest. And then, like Machu Picchu before it, it disappeared. For centuries, the location of Vilcabamba was disputed, debated, and searched for by historians, explorers, and treasure hunters. Hiram Bingham, fresh from his success at Machu Picchu, was convinced that Machu Picchu itself was Vilcabamba, a conclusion that subsequent research has firmly rejected. The actual candidate for Vilcabamba is now generally believed to be a site called Espiritu Pampa, located deep in the jungle to the northwest of Machu Picchu, at a much lower elevation where the cloud forest becomes dense and hot and difficult to move through. Bingham visited Espiritu Pampa briefly, but dismissed it as too small and too jungle-covered to be the legendary city. He was wrong. Later excavations, particularly those conducted in the 1960s and again in subsequent decades, revealed that Espiritu Pampa was much larger than Bingham had seen. The jungle had hidden the extent of it, and that its architecture and artifacts matched the historical descriptions of Vilcabamba with reasonable fidelity. But even now, with a strong scholarly consensus pointing to Espiritu Pampa, the question of Vilcabamba retains its pull. This is partly because the evidence is not absolute. Archaeology rarely delivers absolute conclusions, and partly because the story of Vilcabamba is emotionally charged in a way that pure historical interest cannot fully account for. Vilcabamba was a place of last resort, a place where people went when everything else had been taken from them, where they tried to preserve something of what they had been before the world changed utterly. There is something about that image, a hidden city in the jungle, holding the last flame of a dying civilization, that resonates at a frequency beyond the purely scholarly. Travel now from the Andes to a different kind of landscape entirely, one that could not be more different from the cold, thin-aired mountain world of the Inca. Travel to the jungle, the deep jungle, the kind that produces a green so saturated it almost seems to hum, where the undergrowth is so thick that visibility is measured in meters rather than kilometers, and where the sound of insects is so constant and so loud that it becomes, after a while, a kind of white noise underneath which other sounds, wind, water, your own heartbeat, seem muffled and far away. This is the world of the Maya, and it is a world that held one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history inside its green and steaming interior, a civilization whose achievements were extraordinary and whose decline remains, despite decades of intensive research, only partially understood. The Maya built dozens of cities across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, over a period that spans roughly 3,000 years if you count from the earliest evidence of settled Maya culture to the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. The Classic period, which ran from approximately 250 AD to 900 AD, was the height of Maya urban development, a time when cities like Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, and Calakmul reached populations and levels of architectural sophistication that rivaled anything happening in the contemporary world. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, may have housed as many as 100,000 people at its peak. Its central plaza is flanked by temple pyramids that rise above the jungle canopy, and the view from the top of Temple 1 is the kind that makes you understand, viscerally and immediately, why people build tall things, not because of any practical necessity, but because of the desire to see far, to stand above the world and take in its extent. The Maya are sometimes described as a mysterious civilization, and this description requires some unpacking, because in one very important sense, the Maya are not mysterious at all. Unlike the Inca with their quipu's, the Maya had a fully developed writing system. a logosyllabic script that was substantially deciphered in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly through the work of scholars like Yuri Knorozov, and later Linda Shaley, David Stewart, and many others. Maya inscriptions can be read. Not every glyph has been decoded, and not every text is fully understood, but a very large proportion of surviving Maya writing is now accessible to scholars. This means we can read their history in their own words, their accounts of kings and battles, and astronomical observations and religious ceremonies and political alliances. The Maya are, in this sense, unusually well documented for a pre-Columbian civilization. And yet the mystery of their decline remains genuinely unresolved. This is what is called the classic Maya collapse, which occurred roughly between 800 and 900 AD, a period during which the great southern lowland cities were largely abandoned. The population of some of these cities declined catastrophically, by 90% in some areas over the course of a century or so. The construction of new monuments, which had been a near constant activity at major Maya sites for centuries, stopped. Political systems that had been in place for generations dissolved, and then the jungle moved in, roots and vines working their way into the joints between stones, trees growing through plazas, moss covering the inscriptions that recorded the names and deeds of kings who no longer had subjects. What caused this? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain, and the slightly longer honest answer is that it was probably a combination of things rather than a single catastrophic event. Sustained drought has significant evidential support. Lake sediment cores from the region show clear signs of extended dry periods in the 9th century AD, and Maya agriculture was heavily dependent on rainfall in a landscape without major rivers and with a geology that does not easily support wells. Overpopulation, which had pushed agriculture onto increasingly marginal land through the construction of elaborate terrace and raised field systems, would have made the population particularly vulnerable to any disruption in food supply. Political fragmentation, evidenced by the increasing frequency of warfare between city-states in the late Classic period, would have disrupted the trade networks and administrative systems that had kept the cities functioning. And epidemic disease, while harder to demonstrate archaeologically, cannot be ruled out. What is remarkable is not that the cities were abandoned, but that the process of abandonment is so invisible in the physical record. The cities did not burn, for the most part. They were not destroyed by warfare, for the most part. They were simply left. People walked out of them, and the jungle walked in. The temples still stood. The plazas were still intact. The stelae, the carved stone monuments that recorded the history of the ruling dynasties, still stood in front of the temples, their inscriptions still readable, their images still sharp. It is as though a city simply decided, collectively and without drama, that it was done. The northern Maya cities, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Edsna, and others, continued to flourish after the southern collapse, and some Maya communities maintained urban traditions right up to the Spanish conquest and beyond. The Maya did not disappear. Their descendants number in the millions today, living across the same region their ancestors inhabited, speaking variants of the same languages, maintaining cultural traditions that have survived 500 years of colonial pressure with remarkable resilience. But the great southern cities remained in the jungle, half buried and mostly forgotten by the outside world, until explorers like John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood arrived in the 1840s and produced the first detailed documentation of these ruins for a Western audience. Documentation that shocked and astonished people who had been told or had simply assumed that the Americas before Columbus had been inhabited by people without cities, without architecture, without history. The ruins of Copan and Palenque and Tikal declared otherwise, loudly and in stone. There is a city in the Maya world that deserves special attention, not because it is the most spectacular or the most famous, but because it is perhaps the most genuinely mysterious, in the sense that almost everything about it remains uncertain. That city is Caracol, located in what is now western Belize, and its mystery is not one of absence, but of scale. Caracol was, at its peak in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, one of the largest Maya cities ever built, with a population that may have reached 150,000 people, making it larger than contemporary London or Constantinople. It had a road system. The Maya called these roads sakbiob, white roads, because they were surfaced with white plaster, that extended for tens of kilometers in multiple directions, connecting the city centre to its outlying districts and agricultural zones. It fought wars with major powers like Tikal and won, which was not a small thing. And yet for much of the modern period, Caracol was almost unknown, hidden beneath the jungle canopy of Belize, in an area with no road access and considerable political difficulty for researchers during parts of the 20th century. The full extent of Caracol was only properly mapped using a technology called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which was applied to the region in the late 2000s and early 2010s. LiDAR works by firing laser pulses from aircraft and measuring their return times with great precision, producing topographic data that can penetrate jungle canopy and reveal the ground surface underneath. When researchers applied LiDAR to the Caracol region, they were astonished by what they found. The city was not the modest site suggested by ground-level survey, but an enormous urban complex covering nearly 177 square kilometers, with agricultural terraces, road networks, and suburban settlement extending far beyond what anyone had previously mapped. It was one of the largest discoveries in Maya archaeology in decades, and it happened not through excavation or exploration, but through remote sensing from an aircraft. It raised an obvious and somewhat uncomfortable question. If Caracol had been hidden in plain sight for so long, what else might be out there, waiting for the right instrument to reveal it? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. LiDAR surveys conducted across the broader Maya lowlands in subsequent years revealed traces of urban settlement and agricultural infrastructure on a scale that fundamentally revised estimates of Maya population and land use. The jungle, it became clear, had been hiding not just individual cities, but an entire civilizational landscape, a dense network of towns, cities, roads, farms, and waterworks that had supported tens of millions of people at the height of the classic period. The idea of the Maya as isolated city-states surrounded by trackless wilderness was replaced, fairly rapidly, by the idea of an interconnected urban civilization, whose total extent we are only now beginning to grasp. The jungle had been doing an extraordinarily thorough job of keeping secrets for over 1,000 years, and it yielded them only reluctantly, and only to lasers. Move now from the jungle to the sea, or more precisely, to an island in the sea that was once something more than an island, or rather, to the memory of what that island was before a volcano changed everything. The island is Santorini, in the southern Aegean Sea, and its modern form, a crescent of steep cliffs around a flooded volcanic caldera, whitewashed villages perched at the rim, with a view that has been called the most beautiful in the world, is the result of one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded or near-recorded human history, an event that may have helped inspire one of the most persistent legends in Western culture, the story of Atlantis. The Minoan eruption of Santorini, also called Thera, its ancient name, occurred sometime in the 2nd millennium BC. The precise dating has been a matter of considerable scholarly debate, with estimates ranging from roughly 1750 BC to 1530 BC, a discrepancy that matters enormously for understanding the event's relationship to other Bronze Age developments in the Aegean. What is not disputed is the magnitude of the eruption. It was enormous, among the largest volcanic events of the Holocene epoch, releasing energy equivalent to many hundreds of nuclear weapons, ejecting tens of cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere and producing tsunamis that swept across the eastern Mediterranean with devastating force. The island of Thera was not merely damaged. a significant portion of it simply ceased to exist, collapsing into the emptied magma chamber below and leaving behind the caldera that is now filled by the Aegean Sea. Before the eruption, Thera was home to a substantial Bronze Age settlement known today as Akrotiri, after the modern village near the excavation site. Akrotiri was not a small fishing village. It was a prosperous, sophisticated urban centre, connected by trade networks to Egypt, the Levant, Crete, and mainland Greece, and its material culture, the goods found in its houses, the frescoes painted on its walls, suggests a population that was cosmopolitan, artistically accomplished, and reasonably affluent. The frescoes are particularly remarkable. They show fishermen carrying strings of fish, blue monkeys in a landscape that suggests familiarity with Africa, boxers wearing gloves, elegant women in elaborate dress, and ships sailing between ports decorated with flowers and dolphins. These are not the images of a primitive society. They are the images of a civilization in full and confident bloom, one that had clearly not gotten around to worrying about the mountain at the center of its island. The archaeological evidence suggests that the people of Akrotiri received some warning before the final eruption, a precursor earthquake or series of earthquakes that damaged buildings and apparently prompted many residents to leave, taking their valuables with them. Unlike Pompeii, which was buried so suddenly that human remains are found throughout the ruins, Akrotiri has yielded almost no human skeletons. The city was buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, perfectly preserving its streets, its multi-story buildings, its frescoes, its pottery, its furniture, a complete picture of Bronze Age urban life, frozen at the moment of its abandonment. But the people themselves were elsewhere when the final cataclysm arrived. Where they went and what happened to them afterward is not known. The connection to Atlantis is speculative but compelling. Plato described Atlantis in two dialogues written in the 4th century BC, the Timaeus and the Critias, as a powerful island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato placed the destruction of Atlantis roughly 9,000 years before his own time, which would put it in the 10th millennium BC. Far too early to be Thera, and far too early for human civilization, of the kind Plato described to have existed. This is the main argument against the Thera-Atlantis connection, and it is a serious one. But it is also possible that Plato, drawing on older traditions that had become garbled and exaggerated over centuries of oral transmission, was working with a cultural memory of the Thera catastrophe that had been displaced in time and geography. The details he describes, a powerful island civilization, destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night, sinking beneath the sea, match the Thera event with a suggestiveness that is hard to entirely dismiss. The Minoan civilization of Crete, which was closely connected to Thera, did suffer a dramatic decline in the decades following the eruption. Exactly how much of this decline was caused directly by the eruption and its tsunamis, and how much by other factors, remains debated. But the combination of a sophisticated island culture and a volcanic catastrophe of staggering scale is the kind of event that leaves marks on cultural memory, and cultural memory is exactly what Plato claimed to be transmitting. Whether Atlantis was real, mythologized, or entirely invented, the story has proven to be one of the most tenacious in Western imagination. It has generated a literature of thousands of books and an industry of speculation that ranges from the serious and scholarly to the frankly ridiculous. People have placed Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in the Canary Islands, in the North Sea, in Bolivia, and in a number of other locations that require increasingly creative readings of Plato's text. None of these hypotheses has achieved anything approaching mainstream archaeological acceptance. The honest answer is that if Atlantis was based on a real place, the strongest candidate remains Thera, and if it was not based on a real place, It was an extraordinarily effective philosophical thought experiment that has haunted human culture for nearly 2,400 years. Thera is interesting for another reason beyond the Atlantis question, one that is perhaps more historically grounded and in some ways more significant. The eruption of Thera sent a pulse of volcanic aerosols into the stratosphere that would have affected climate across the northern hemisphere, potentially reducing growing seasons and causing crop failures at distances of thousands of kilometers from the eruption site. Some researchers have proposed connections between the Thera eruption and the weakening of the Shang dynasty in China, famines in Egypt, the decline of palace cultures in the Aegean, and disruptions in the Near East, a domino effect of climatic disruption set off by a single geological event. This is controversial, partly because the dating of the eruption is still not fully settled, and partly because attributing political and cultural changes across such vast distances to a single volcanic event requires a chain of causation that is difficult to demonstrate rigorously. But the possibility is real, and it points to something important about the fragility of ancient civilizations. How easily a disruption to agricultural systems, to climate patterns, to the rhythms of planting and harvest that everything else depended on could unravel even the most sophisticated and well-organized societies. The fragility of sophistication is a theme that runs through almost every lost city story, and it is worth pausing here to consider it. When we look at the ruins of a great city, the pyramids of Tikal rising above the jungle canopy, the terraced fields of Machu Picchu carved into the mountainside, the painted rooms of Akrotiri sealed under their blanket of ash, we tend to feel, first, a sense of awe at the achievement, and then, following hard on the heels of that awe, a sense of sadness at the loss. Both of these responses are natural, but they rest on an assumption that deserves examination. The assumption that these cities were lost because something went wrong, that their abandonment was a failure, a fall, a defeat. This assumption is not always correct. Sometimes cities are abandoned because the people who built them chose to go somewhere else, because the land was exhausted, or the water supply had changed, or a new political arrangement made a different location more practical, or simply because human restlessness, that deep species-wide urge to move and adapt and try something new, reasserted itself. The abandoned city in this reading is not a monument to failure, but a monument to the willingness to let go of the past and move into the future. This is harder to romanticize, which is probably why it is less popular as a narrative than the catastrophic collapse, but it is often more accurate. Take the case of the ancestral Puebloans, a name given by archaeologists to the people who inhabited the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, roughly the area where the modern states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, from roughly 100 BC through the late 13th century AD. The ancestral Puebloans built some of the most remarkable architecture in pre-Columbian North America, including the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado, which cling to the undersides of sandstone alcoves like swallows' nests, and the great houses of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, multi-story stone buildings of a scale and geometric precision that required both sophisticated architectural planning and considerable social organization to construct. Chaco Canyon in particular has the quality of a mystery wrapped in a puzzle. The great houses there, Pueblo Bonito is the largest and most famous, but there are others, were built between roughly 850 AD and 1150 AD, reaching their peak of complexity and population in the 11th and early 12th centuries. At its height, Chaco was apparently the center of a regional network that extended for hundreds of kilometers in multiple directions, connected by roads, straight, engineered roads that cut through the desert with a geometrical precision that suggests careful planning, and by a system of signaling stations that may have used fire or reflected light to communicate between distant communities. The people of Chaco imported timber from forests more than 80 kilometers away, turquoise from sources throughout the southwest, and ceramics from communities across an enormous area. They were networked, organized, and deeply connected to a landscape they had been working for centuries. And then, in the late 12th and 13th centuries, they left. Not all at once, not entirely. The process of depopulation took decades rather than years, but the great houses were gradually vacated, the roads fell quiet, the signal stations went dark, and the canyon that had been the hub of a regional civilization became, again, a place of wind and sandstone and silence. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were similarly abandoned, the beautifully constructed rooms sealed or simply vacated, the ladder rungs pulled up, the hearths gone cold. By approximately 1290 AD, the Four Corners region had been largely depopulated by the ancestral Puebloans, and the descendants of those people, the Pueblo peoples of modern New Mexico and Arizona, the Hopi, the Zuni, and others, had relocated to the Rio Grande Valley and other areas to the south and east. Why? Again, drought is a significant part of the answer. The late 13th century brought one of the worst sustained droughts in the archaeological record of the Southwest, and an agricultural society in a desert environment has precious little margin when the rains fail. But the abandonment of Chaco and Mesa Verde preceded this drought, and the people did not simply disappear. They moved, deliberately and presumably with considerable social organization, to new locations where they rebuilt their communities and continued the cultural traditions that their descendants maintain today. This is not a collapse. This is a migration, a reorganization, a conscious response to changing conditions by a people who knew their landscape well and had seen its cycles of abundance and scarcity over many generations. The mystery of the ancestral Puebloans is, in some ways, less a mystery than a reminder that human communities are adaptive organisms, capable of reading the signals their environment sends them and responding accordingly. But Chaco retains its mystery regardless of the practical explanations, because the practical explanations do not quite account for the scale and ambition of what was built there. The great houses of Chaco are oriented with astronomical precision. The walls and doorways align to the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, to the lunar standstill cycle, to celestial phenomena that the Chacons clearly watched and measured with great care over many years. Pueblo Bonito has a wall running precisely north to south for some distance. The site of Casa Rinconada, a great circular ceremonial structure called a kiva, is aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that required deliberate planning. The roads that radiate from Chaco are oriented with the same geometric precision, running arrow straight across terrain that would have made curving around obstacles the more practical choice. All of this suggests a civilization that placed enormous importance on the relationship between human-made space and cosmic order, that built its cities not just as functional settlements, but as instruments for reading and honoring the sky. This dimension of Chaco, the ceremonial, the astronomical, the cosmological, is one that archaeology can document but not fully explain, because the Chacons left no written records, and the oral traditions of their Pueblo descendants, while rich and complex, have not yielded a simple interpretive key that unlocks the meaning of every alignment and every road. The Chacoans knew something about the sky that we are only partially recovering, and the knowledge they encoded in stone and alignment was evidently important enough to justify an enormous expenditure of labor and resources in its service. What that knowledge meant to them, what story it told, what relationship it expressed between human beings and the cosmos, is something we approach with instruments and inference, but cannot quite reach with our hands. Carry that sense of reaching, the reaching of modern inquiry toward ancient knowledge, into a different hemisphere and a different landscape, one that is arid in a different way from the American Southwest, where the aridity is the aridity of high desert, the kind that is cold at night and dazzling by day. This new landscape is flat, immense, and in some places almost supernaturally desolate. The Atacama Desert and its surroundings in northern Chile, close to the Pacific coast, where some weather stations have gone years without recording a measurable rainfall, and where the dryness of the air preserves organic material, cloth, wood, skin, hair, with an efficiency that rivals the embalming practices of Egypt. In this landscape, and in the broader Andean world that surrounds it, there are traces of civilizations that preceded the Inca by many centuries, civilizations that built in ways that leave you standing in the ruins, wondering not just what happened, but how. How did they do this? Here, in this place, with these conditions, and with what we assume were the technological limitations of their time. The Tiwanaku civilization, centered on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia and Peru, provides a useful example. Tiwanaku flourished for roughly 1,000 years, reaching its peak between roughly 500 AD and 1000 AD, and at its height it was the center of a regional influence that spread across the Andes and the Pacific coast, its distinctive art style and religious iconography appearing in communities hundreds of kilometers from the capital. The capital itself, also called Tiwanaku, was a planned urban center whose ceremonial core included monumental stone gateways, sunken temple courts, large platform mounds, and one of the most celebrated single pieces of Andean stonework, the Gateway of the Sun, a single massive stone block carved with an elaborate frieze that depicts a central figure, possibly a deity, possibly a ruler, probably both, surrounded by 48 running figures in profile, each with wings and a condor head. The carving is detailed, precise, and still visually arresting after more than 1,000 years of exposure to the high Andean sun and cold. Tiwanaku's agricultural system was one of the most ingenious ever developed in the ancient world. Around Lake Titicaca, the land is subject to killing frosts even in the growing season, and the soil near the lake is often waterlogged. The Tiwanaku solution was a system of raised fields, platforms of earth separated by channels of water, that addressed both problems simultaneously. The water in the channels absorbed solar heat during the day and released it at night, creating a microclimate that raised temperatures in the field beds by several degrees, enough to protect crops from frost. The channels also provided irrigation, drained excess water from the raised beds, and created habitat for fish and aquatic plants that enriched the soil with organic matter. The raised field system supported a very large agricultural population on land that would otherwise have been only marginally productive, and when modern experimental archaeologists rebuilt sections of the ancient raised fields and put them back into cultivation in the 1980s and 1990s, the yields were remarkable, high enough to feed a substantial population on a fraction of the cultivated area the region currently uses. And then Tiwanaku collapsed in the 11th century AD, with a speed that the archaeological record suggests was quite rapid by civilizational standards, perhaps a century or less. The cause, again, was almost certainly drought. Lake Titicaca, which sits at about 3,800 meters above sea level and is the largest high-altitude lake in the world, is fed by Andean glacial meltwater and seasonal rainfall, and sediment cores from the lake bottom show a clear and severe reduction in lake levels in the late first millennium AD. The raised field system that had supported Tiwanaku's agricultural economy required specific water levels to function properly. Too little water, and the system breaks down. When the rains failed, the fields failed. When the fields failed, the population could not be fed. When the population could not be fed, the political and religious systems that depended on agricultural surplus collapsed along with everything else. The capital was abandoned. The stone-faced platform mounds were stripped by later visitors for building material, and the Gateway of the Sun was left standing in what had become a largely empty landscape. What remained was the stonework, more than enough to astonish later visitors and inspire, inevitably, the kind of speculation that reaches for supernatural explanations when the mundane ones seem insufficient. The stones at Tiwanaku are enormous. The largest weigh over 100 tons. They were transported from quarries some distance away, across water or over ground, using methods that scholars debate, but which clearly did not include wheeled vehicles or large domesticated draft animals beyond the llama. Useful for carrying loads, but not for pulling stones of this scale. The precision of the stonework includes, in some cases, recessed channels and projecting tenons cut into the stone faces that appear to have been designed for a kind of metal fastening or clamp, and bronze eye-shaped clamps were indeed found at the site, apparently used to lock stone blocks together. This is sophisticated civil engineering, and it speaks to a level of technical competence that does not require mystical explanation. It requires, rather, respect for the problem-solving abilities of people who had been working with stone in a demanding mountain environment for many generations. But respect for engineering competence does not fully account for the visual and emotional impact of Tiwanaku, which retains, even in its diminished and partially dismantled state, a quality of deliberate grandeur. The sense that the people who built it intended to create something that would be felt as well as seen, something that would press on the nervous system with the weight of the sacred. The Gateway of the Sun was not a functional structure in the way that a wall or a drainage channel is functional. It was a statement about the relationship between the human and the divine, carved in stone large enough and permanent enough to outlast not just the people who made it, but the civilization that gave it meaning. It has done exactly that. Drift now eastward, across the Pacific in imagination rather than in fact, across the widest ocean on Earth, past island chains and seamounts, and the vast empty blue of the Central Pacific, until the landscape changes again and you are in Southeast Asia, in the complex of waterways and floodplains and forested hills that surrounds the Mekong River and its tributaries. This is the world of the Khmer Empire, and it is the world of Angkor, a city so large, so elaborate, and so carefully integrated into its landscape that its true extent was not appreciated until, again, LiDAR technology was applied to the region in the early 21st century, and revealed an urban complex covering over 1,000 square kilometers, making it the largest pre-industrial city the world has ever known. Angkor is not, strictly speaking, a lost city. Like Machu Picchu, it was always known to the people who lived near it, the descendants of the Khmer Empire, the monks who maintained the temple of Angkor Wat, as a place of worship without interruption from its construction in the 12th century AD to the present day. Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument ever built, its central tower rising above a moat that is nearly 200 meters wide and several kilometers long, its walls covered with some of the most extensive bas-relief carving in the world, nearly half a kilometer of continuous carved stone depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, from the history of the Khmer kings, and from everyday life in the 12th century. The detail is extraordinary. You can study a single meter of Angkor Wat's bas-reliefs for an hour and still be discovering things. Individual faces in a crowd, gestures of soldiers and dancers and courtiers that somehow remain fully human across 9 centuries of stone. The Khmer Empire that built Angkor flourished between roughly 800 AD and 1500 AD, with its peak during the 11th through 13th centuries. At its height, the empire controlled a vast area of mainland Southeast Asia, from what is now southern Thailand and Cambodia, through parts of Laos and Vietnam, and its capital at Angkor was home to perhaps 700,000 to 1 million people. An enormous urban population sustained by one of the most sophisticated water management systems ever built. The Khmer engineers constructed an elaborate network of reservoirs, called barrays, and canals that captured the monsoon rains of the wet season and distributed water through the dry season, enabling intensive rice agriculture across the broad, flat plains around Angkor. The West Baray alone, the largest of the reservoirs, is roughly 8 kilometers long and 2.5 kilometers wide, an enormous human-made lake that was dug by hand and that still holds water today. The Khmer Empire's decline began in the 13th century and was probably accelerated by several converging pressures. The rise of Theravada Buddhism, which shifted religious life away from the divine king system that had underpinned the empire's ideology, the growing power of neighboring kingdoms in what is now Thailand, and the increasing burden of maintaining the elaborate water management system on which the city's agriculture depended. There is also intriguing evidence, again from paleoclimatological sources, that the 14th and 15th centuries brought a period of unusually variable monsoons to Southeast Asia, alternating severe droughts and catastrophic floods that would have played havoc with the carefully calibrated hydraulic system around Angkor. A system designed to moderate the variability of monsoon rainfall would have been vulnerable to extreme variability that exceeded its design parameters, and there are signs in the archaeological record that the Khmer engineers were making repeated emergency repairs to their water infrastructure in the centuries before Angkor was finally depopulated. The Khmer capital moved southward to the area of modern Phnom Penh in the 15th century, and Angkor was gradually abandoned as an urban centre, though never as a sacred site. The jungle grew over the residential and administrative quarters, the causeways became overgrown, and the secondary temples and towers were reclaimed by tree roots that are now inseparable from the structures they were destroying and supporting simultaneously. The famous photograph of Angkor's Ta Prohm Temple, with the vast roots of silk cotton trees flowing over and through the stone walls like grey waterfalls frozen in time, has become one of the most recognizable images in archaeology, a visual shorthand for the idea of nature reclaiming what humanity has made, which is both beautiful and slightly terrifying, depending on your mood. What the LiDAR surveys of the early 21st century revealed was that the urban landscape of Angkor extended far beyond the monumental temples that had been studied and photographed for decades. The surveys, conducted by a team led by archaeologist Damien Evans, revealed the outlines of a vast grid of streets, ponds, mounds, and field systems, covering an area that dwarfed previous estimates. They also revealed something unexpected, evidence that the hydraulic system had been repeatedly modified, extended, and in some cases partially dismantled and rebuilt, suggesting a city that was constantly adapting its infrastructure to changing conditions. The story of Angkor's decline was not simply one of external pressure or climatic bad luck, but of a complex urban system struggling to maintain itself against the accumulating weight of its own success. A city so large, requiring so much water management, so much rice to feed its population, so much labor to maintain its temples and reservoirs and roads, that even small disruptions to any part of the system could cascade into larger failures. This is, in a way, a very modern story. Cities today face versions of the same challenge. The challenge of maintaining complex, interconnected infrastructure systems that become more vulnerable to disruption as they grow more sophisticated. Angkor's engineers were grappling with the same basic problem that city planners grapple with now. How do you build a system large enough to support a large population without making it so complex and interdependent that a failure in one part cascades through everything else? The Khmer did not solve this problem, and neither, if we are honest, have we. But they worked on it for 600 years, and the solutions they developed were ingenious enough that the physical remains of their water system are still visible from the air, still traceable on the ground, and in some places still functional. Cross now to a different world again, to the Arabian Peninsula, to a landscape that is mostly sand and rock, and the particular quality of heat that comes off desert surfaces in the midday sun. A heat you do not just feel on your skin, but inside your lungs, as though the air itself has been rendered down to its essentials, and everything superfluous has been burned away. In this landscape, in what is now Yemen and the surrounding region, the ancient kingdoms of southern Arabia built cities and trade networks of astonishing richness, funded by their control of the incense trade. Frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins that the ancient world burned in temples and used in medicine and anointed on the bodies of the dead, commodities so valuable that their trade routes were among the most profitable in the ancient world. The most famous of these ancient southern Arabian kingdoms was Sheba, or Saba, to use the name its own people used, whose queen appears in the Hebrew Bible and in the Quran as a figure of wisdom, wealth, and political acumen, traveling to meet King Solomon I of Israel and exchanging with him gifts of spices and gold and hard questions. Whether this encounter happened historically, whether the Queen of Sheba was a real individual rather than a legendary personification of a trading civilization, is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that the kingdom of Saba was real, archaeologically documented, and genuinely impressive in its achievements. Its capital was the city of Marib, in what is now northern Yemen, and Marib was home to one of the most ambitious hydraulic engineering projects in the ancient world. The Great Dam of Marib, built in the 8th century BC and expanded and maintained over the following millennium, was a feat of engineering whose sophistication is still impressive by modern standards. The dam collected the seasonal flash floods that poured down from the highlands after rain, and diverted the water into a network of canals and sluices that irrigated a substantial agricultural zone. Some estimates suggest the irrigated area covered around 9,600 hectares, in what would otherwise have been unproductive desert. The Sabaean civilization that the dam supported was wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply connected to the wider ancient world through the incense trade. Marib's temples, particularly the Oval Temple, known as the Baran Temple, and the Moon Temple at Marib, were elaborate religious structures that suggest a rich ceremonial life organized around a pantheon that included moon deities and other figures of considerable cosmic significance to the Sabaeans. The dam collapsed in the late 6th century AD, possibly around 570 AD, and the flood that resulted drove population from the area and contributed to the fragmentation of the social and agricultural order that had sustained Marib for over 1,000 years. The collapse of the dam is mentioned in the Quran as a significant historical event, the flood of Iram, which destroyed the gardens of Sheba, and it has an interesting resonance with a broader pattern of late antique disruption that also produced the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the decline of Sassanid Persia, and other large-scale civilizational changes in the 5th through 7th centuries AD. Whether these events were connected, whether they shared common causes in climate change or pandemic disease, or some combination of stressors that proved too much for ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations, is a question that historians and archaeologists are still actively working on. The city of Iram, sometimes called Iram of the Pillars, is another Arabian mystery, a city described in the Quran as a place of extraordinary grandeur, built by the ancient people called the Ad, and destroyed by divine punishment for their pride and impiety. Whether Iram was a real place or a purely legendary construction has been debated for centuries. In 1992, a researcher named Nicholas Clapp claimed to have located the ruins of Iram at a site called Shisar in Oman, based on a combination of satellite imagery analysis and historical texts. The site, which is a genuine archaeological site with structures dating to the 3rd millennium BC, was given considerable attention, and some scholars found the identification plausible. Others disagreed strongly, arguing that the site was too small and too different from the description in the Quran to be Iram, and that the identification was driven more by enthusiasm and media interest than by rigorous archaeological analysis. The question remains open, which is perhaps the appropriate state for a question about a city that may have been legendary from the beginning. The Arabian Peninsula also contains traces of the kingdom of the Nabateans, a people who built one of the most spectacular cities of the ancient world in a location that seems, at first, designed to make construction as difficult as possible. Petra, in what is now southern Jordan, is carved into rose-red sandstone cliffs in a valley accessible through narrow gorges, and the Nabateans turned this seemingly impractical location into one of the most prosperous trading cities of the ancient Near East, controlling the flow of frankincense and other luxury goods between the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean world, and beyond. The city's most famous structure, the building known as the Treasury, Al-Khazne in Arabic, is carved directly into the cliff face, its elaborate facade rising over 40 meters from the floor of the gorge, its columns and pediments and niches executed in the local sandstone with a delicacy that seems almost implausible given the scale of the work and the hardness of the material. It is, to use a word that gets overused in travel writing, but which is genuinely appropriate here, breathtaking. Petra was not lost in the sense that Machu Picchu was lost, or that Angkor was obscured by jungle. It was simply outside the routes that most Europeans travelled in the medieval and early modern periods, and the Bedouin tribes who lived in and around the ancient ruins had good reasons of their own to keep their knowledge to themselves. The Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt reached Petra in 1812, disguised as an Arab traveller, and introduced it to the wider Western world with a report that caused considerable excitement. The ruins he found were extensive and remarkable, and subsequent excavation has revealed a city that was not merely a collection of rock-cut facades, but a fully functional urban centre with temples, baths, colonnaded streets, a theatre, and a sophisticated water management system. The Nabateans were extraordinarily skilled hydraulic engineers, carving channels and pipes into the rock and managing water in a desert environment with remarkable efficiency. Petra's decline came gradually, beginning with the annexation of the Nabatean kingdom by Rome in 106 AD, and accelerating after the Byzantine period as trade routes shifted and the city's commercial importance diminished. A devastating earthquake in 363 AD damaged much of the city and may have accelerated depopulation. By the early medieval period, Petra was largely abandoned, though the gorges and rock faces that had once housed a city of perhaps 20,000 people continued to shelter small communities of Bedouin and occasional Christian monks. The great carved facades stood empty, their interiors used sometimes as shelters, sometimes as churches, sometimes simply as windows into a past that had become, even to the people who lived among its ruins, distant and half-legendary. Walk now through a door in time and geography that leads to a landscape utterly unlike any of the previous ones, not mountain or jungle or desert or sea cliff, but open savanna, the enormous grass-covered plateau of sub-Saharan Africa, where the light is golden and horizontal in the late afternoon, and the horizon is immensely far away. In this landscape, in what is now Zimbabwe, there stands a collection of stone ruins that represents one of the most significant and most politically complicated archaeological sites in Africa. Great Zimbabwe, the largest ancient stone structure south of the Sahara, and the site from which Zimbabwe, meaning stone houses or venerated houses in the Shona language, takes its name. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a Shona-speaking kingdom that flourished between roughly 1100 AD and 1500 AD, built its wealth on cattle herding and the trade in gold and ivory with Swahili merchants on the Indian Ocean coast, and at its peak housed a population of perhaps 18,000 people in and around its stone enclosures. The stonework is built without mortar, like the Inca masonry of Machu Picchu, using a technique called dry stone walling, in which flat granite slabs are carefully fitted together, the natural layering of the local granite lending itself to this approach with reasonable ease. The walls are elegant, curving rather than rectilinear in many places, and in the most carefully built sections, they display a decorative chevron pattern, created by alternating the orientation of the stones. The great enclosure, the largest single structure at the site, is an oval wall nearly 11 meters high and up to 5 meters thick, enclosing an area of some 840 square meters, and containing within it a mysterious conical tower, solid, without interior, and of uncertain purpose. That is one of the more enigmatic structures in African archaeology. Great Zimbabwe's story is complicated not just by the genuine archaeological mysteries it presents, but by a long and ugly history of denial. In the colonial period, European scholars and administrators were so unwilling to accept that indigenous Africans could have built something of this scale and quality that they invented alternative origins. Phoenicians, Arabs, ancient Israelites, the Queen of Sheba herself, for the ruins. These alternative theories had no archaeological support and considerable archaeological evidence against them, but they persisted, in some cases well into the 20th century, because they served the ideological needs of a colonial system that depended on the narrative of African incapacity. The consensus of modern archaeology, that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the modern Shona people, using local materials and local labor for purposes that combined residential, ceremonial, and administrative functions, is not controversial among scholars. It is simply accurate. What remains genuinely mysterious is the nature of the political and religious system that Great Zimbabwe represented, the reasons for its decline in the 15th century, and the full extent of the network of stone enclosures. There are over 200 sites in the broader region, suggesting that the Zimbabwe culture was not a single isolated phenomenon, but a widespread tradition of stone construction and political organization. The gold trade that sustained Great Zimbabwe's wealth was connected to a much larger Indian Ocean trading network, and Zimbabwe gold has been found at archaeological sites across the coast and beyond. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe were not isolated potentates, but participants in a world system of commerce and exchange that connected sub-Saharan Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe in the 15th century appears to have been connected to shifts in trade routes, and possibly to environmental pressure from overgrazing, as the large cattle herds that were both the foundation of Shona wealth and a mark of status depleted the pasture around the capital. The political center of the Zimbabwe culture shifted northward and westward, and Great Zimbabwe subsided into the kind of semi-abandonment that preserved it without maintaining it. Move now to a civilization that built in a medium other than stone, or rather, that built primarily in mud brick, a material whose durability in dry climates is astonishing, but whose vulnerability to water makes it one of the more fragile building materials for long-term survival. Move to the Indus Valley, to the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and the dozens of other sites that together constitute what archaeologists call the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan Civilization, which flourished between roughly 2600 BC and 1900 BC in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, and which at its height was the largest civilization on Earth by area and possibly by population. The Indus Valley Civilization is one of the 4 great civilizations of the ancient world, alongside Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and ancient China, and it is by far the most poorly understood of the 4. This is partly because the Indus script, which appears on thousands of small seals and tablets found throughout the civilization's extent, has not been deciphered. Unlike Maya glyphs or Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus script has yielded to no recognized analytical approach, and while there are many proposed decipherments, none has achieved scholarly consensus. This means that the people of the Indus Valley have left us their cities, their artifacts, their art, and their seals, but not, in any accessible sense, their words. What the physical remains tell us is remarkable. Mohenjo-Daro, one of the two largest Indus cities, was laid out on a grid plan with remarkable regularity. Streets running north-south and east-west, with a consistency that suggests centralized urban planning rather than the organic growth of most ancient cities. The houses were built of standardized baked mud bricks. The bricks across different Indus sites follow the same dimensional ratios, suggesting either a centralized production system or a widely shared standard. And many of them had their own wells and bathrooms with drainage systems connected to covered municipal sewers that ran beneath the main streets. Mohenjo-Daro had a great bath, a large, watertight pool of fired brick that may have been used for ritual bathing, and a large building sometimes called a granary, though its actual function is debated. The city may have had a population of 40,000 to 80,000 people at its peak, which would have made it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. What the Indus Valley civilization did not appear to have in any obvious archaeological form is kings. There are no royal palaces, no temples with obvious state religious functions, no monumental public sculpture of rulers in the manner of Egypt or Mesopotamia, no elaborate royal burials. The society appears to have been, in some material sense, unusually egalitarian. The variation in house sizes and in burial goods is much smaller than in contemporary Mesopotamian cities, suggesting a social structure that did not concentrate wealth and status in a small elite to the same extreme degree that other ancient civilizations did. This is puzzling in a very productive way, because it raises the question of how you organize and maintain a city of tens of thousands of people without, apparently, a visible royal class. What kind of political system produces great urban planning and standardized infrastructure without also producing great palaces and royal monuments? The answer may be there in the material record, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to learn to ask the right questions. The Indus Valley civilization declined between 1900 BC and 1700 BC, in a process that may have involved another of those great Bronze Age climatic disruptions, the same weakening of monsoon systems that appears to have affected other civilizations of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. The cities shrank. The standardized brick sizes and writing system disappeared from the record. The population dispersed, apparently moving eastward toward the Gangetic Plain. The great cities of the Indus Valley were gradually buried under the silt of changed river courses. The Indus and its tributaries have shifted their routes significantly over the past 4,000 years, and forgotten, not just by the outside world, but by the people of the Indian subcontinent itself, for whom these cities were as remote in time and culture as the Bronze Age is for us. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were not rediscovered until the 1920s, when British archaeologists working for the Archaeological Survey of India recognized that the brick ruins being plundered for railway ballast were not just ordinary ruins, but the remains of a previously unknown civilization of enormous extent and complexity. The discovery was one of the most significant in 20th century archaeology, fundamentally changing understanding of the ancient world and pushing the origins of South Asian civilization back by more than a millennium from where they had previously been thought to start. And yet, the Indus Valley civilization remains, in the public imagination, far less familiar than Egypt or Mesopotamia or even the Maya. Perhaps because without deciphered writing, without the royal narratives that make ancient civilizations feel populated with individual human beings we can relate to, the Indus remains slightly abstract, a civilization defined more by what we do not know about it than by what we do. This is perhaps appropriate in a way. The lost cities of the world are, collectively, a lesson in epistemic humility, in the recognition that our knowledge of the past is not a complete record, but a highly partial and accident-dependent one, shaped by what survived, what was found, what was studied, and what was understood. The cities that have been discovered are almost certainly a small fraction of those that existed. The texts that have been deciphered are a small fraction of those that were written. The stories we tell about ancient civilizations are reconstructions from fragments, and the fragments were selected not by any deliberate archival process, but by the random interactions of time, climate, archaeology, and luck. What burned, burned. What decomposed, decomposed. What was buried in dry sand or sealed by volcanic ash survived, more or less by accident, and we build our understanding of the past from these accidents as best we can. Consider the city of Cahokia, which stood near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now the state of Illinois, and which at its peak around 1100 AD was home to perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people, making it the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico and larger than London at the same period. Cahokia was the center of a culture archaeologists call Mississippian, characterized by platform mound construction, a complex ranked society, long-distance trade, and a cosmology centered on the relationship between the earth and the sky. Its central mound, Monk's Mound, named for a community of Trappist monks who farmed its terraces in the 19th century, is the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America, covering an area at its base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza and rising nearly 30 meters. It was built entirely by hand, without metal tools, without draft animals other than humans, in a process that took generations. Cahokia was not discovered in the dramatic sense that Machu Picchu or Great Zimbabwe were discovered, because it was never entirely lost. The mounds remained visible on the landscape, and they were remarked on by European settlers, who did not initially understand what they were. The recognition of Cahokia as the remains of a sophisticated pre-Columbian city, rather than natural landforms or the work of some unknown ancient people, came gradually, as archaeology developed as a discipline, and as researchers began the slow work of excavating the mounds and the surrounding landscape. Even now, Cahokia is less famous than it deserves to be, given its scale and significance. It sits beside a busy American highway, partially developed, its surviving mounds administered as a state historic site that receives a fraction of the visitors that go to far more distant and less significant archaeological sites. The lost city in this case is lost not in the archaeological sense, but in the cultural one. Hidden in plain sight, underappreciated, undervalued, a monument to a civilization that most Americans know almost nothing about. Cahokia's decline, like that of so many lost cities, is poorly understood. The city shrank significantly after about 1200 AD and was largely abandoned by 1400 AD. Climate change, specifically the onset of the medieval warm period followed by the Little Ice Age, may have disrupted the agricultural systems that supported the population. Political instability, resource depletion, and conflict with neighboring groups may also have played roles. What is clear is that the decline was real, that the population dispersed, that the great mounds were left empty of the wooden buildings and ritual activities that had once covered them, and that by the time European settlers arrived in the region, the people who had built Cahokia were long gone, and the oral traditions that might have preserved detailed memory of the city had not survived, or had not been collected before they were lost. This is the moment, near the end of this long journey through lost cities and abandoned landscapes, to sit for a moment with the question that has been hovering at the edge of the story from the beginning. What does it mean that cities can be lost? Not just archaeologically lost, in the sense of buried or overgrown, but culturally lost in the sense of forgotten, disconnected from the living traditions of the people who built them. What does it mean that whole civilizations, a sophisticated, complex, creative, with their own art and music and literature and religion and daily life, can vanish so completely from human memory that later generations looking at their ruins can scarcely imagine who built them or why. It means, among other things, that the present moment is less permanent than it feels. The civilizations that have disappeared were not, by and large, civilizations that thought they would disappear. They built for permanence, in stone, in fired brick, in earthwork mounds that were designed to last. They embedded their knowledge in architecture and art and infrastructure, encoding what they knew about the sky and the seasons, and the relationship between the human and the divine, into the very orientation of their buildings and the flow of their water systems. They had languages and literatures and governing structures and social norms and religious beliefs. Everything that a civilization needs to feel from the inside, like something enduring rather than something temporary. And yet they passed, not entirely, not without trace, not without descendants who carry forward in ways both visible and invisible something of what those civilizations were. The Maya did not disappear. They are here, millions of them, in Guatemala and Mexico and Belize and Honduras, still speaking languages that would be recognizable to the scribes who carved the inscriptions at Palenque. The Quechua-speaking descendants of the Inca still live in the Andes, still work the land, still maintain traditions whose roots predate the Spanish invasion by centuries. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest still build, still dance, still practice ceremonies, whose origins reach back through Chaco and beyond. The Shona people of Zimbabwe still exist, still speak their language, still inhabit the landscape where Great Zimbabwe was built. Civilizations do not die cleanly. They transform, fragment, persist in partial forms, resurface in unexpected places. The people who abandon a city carry it with them in memory and in practice, even when the memory becomes attenuated and the practice becomes unrecognizable to outsiders. The cities themselves, the physical remains, become part of a different kind of story, a story about time and stone and the persistence of human-made forms in an environment that is slowly, patiently, determinedly working to reclaim them. There is one more city to visit before this journey ends, and it is perhaps the most poignant of all the lost cities because it was not lost through drought or invasion or political collapse, but through a much simpler and more human process. It was deliberately abandoned, and it was abandoned by one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world, who built it in the first place as an expression of a religious vision so radical that it provoked a reaction violent enough to erase not just the city, but very nearly the memory of its builder from history. The city is Amarna in Egypt, and its builder was the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten ruled Egypt in the 14th century BC during the 18th dynasty, and he was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most extraordinary individuals to ever sit on a royal throne, a man who, in roughly 17 years of rule, attempted to overturn 3,000 years of Egyptian religious tradition by abolishing the traditional pantheon and declaring that there was only one god, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. This was not merely a theological reform. In Egypt, where the pharaoh was himself divine, and where the state religious system was intimately bound up with every aspect of governance, agriculture, trade, and social life, a religious revolution was a revolution in everything. Akhenaten did not just change the god, he changed the art. The rigid formal conventions of 3,000 years of Egyptian artistic representation gave way to a naturalistic style, sinuous and strange, in which the pharaoh and his family were depicted in intimate domestic scenes utterly unlike anything in the previous Egyptian tradition. He changed the administrative center. He built, from scratch, on a blank stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile, a new capital city dedicated to the Aten, Akhetaten, which we now call Amarna. Amarna was built with extraordinary speed. Within a decade of Akhenaten's declaration of his new religious order, a city of perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 people had been established on what had previously been uninhabited desert, complete with palaces, temples open to the sky, so that the Aten's light could fall directly on the altars, residential districts, administrative buildings, workshops, and roads. The city lasted as a functioning capital for roughly 15 years. After Akhenaten's death, the circumstances of which remain unclear, his successors, including the young Tutankhamun, moved the capital back to Thebes and Memphis, restored the old gods, and began the systematic erasure of Akhenaten's legacy. His images were defaced, his name was carved out of inscriptions, his city was systematically stripped of its stone, which was taken for use in other construction projects, a fate that befell so many ancient structures, and abandoned. The abandonment of Amarna was so complete that by the time of the later New Kingdom, it had been largely forgotten, buried under desert sand and Nile silt, its very existence uncertain to historians who knew only that there had been a heretic pharaoh, whose name had been deliberately omitted from the royal lists. The city was rediscovered in the 18th and 19th centuries, and its excavation, which is still ongoing, has produced one of the richest and most detailed pictures of life in any ancient Egyptian city. Amarna was abandoned so quickly and so completely that many of its houses were left with their contents more or less intact. Bread was found in ovens. Tools were found where workers had set them down. The personal letters of Akhenaten's foreign correspondents, the Amarna letters, one of the most important diplomatic archives of the ancient world, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, were found in what had been the city's records office, apparently overlooked by those who dismantled everything else. The Amarna letters alone would be enough to make the site extraordinary. They offer a window into the international diplomacy of the late Bronze Age, with kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Cyprus, and Canaan writing to the Egyptian pharaoh about military alliances, gold shipments, royal marriages, and the 1,000 diplomatic courtesies and grievances of the ancient Near Eastern world. But Amarna offers much more than that. It offers a picture of what a new city looks like, not the accretions of centuries of building and rebuilding that characterize most ancient cities, but a city designed and built in a single generation, with a coherence of plan and purpose that is almost unique in the archaeological record. And it offers, through the art and the physical remains, an unusually intimate view of one man's vision, a vision so radical and so personal that it reshaped the city around him, and then, when he was gone, could not survive without him. There is something very human about Akhenaten's city, something that connects it to all the other lost cities in this story, and to the human impulse. Boundless, restless, sometimes glorious and sometimes destructive. To build. To mark the landscape with the evidence of your existence. To say in stone and brick and carved inscription and painted wall, we were here, we thought these things, we believed in this, we made this. The cities that have been lost were not failures of ambition. Most of them were remarkable achievements, the products of people who understood their landscapes and their materials, who organized labor on enormous scales, who embedded their understanding of the cosmos in the structures they raised, who fed and clothed and governed large populations with a sophistication that deserves respect rather than surprise. What they could not always do was adapt fast enough to changes they had not anticipated, changes in climate, in trade routes, in political arrangements, in the ecological carrying capacity of the land they had farmed for generations. This is not a condemnation. it is a recognition. The forces that brought down Tiwanaku and Angkor and Great Zimbabwe and Mohenjo-Daro were, in most cases, forces of considerable magnitude, sustained droughts, shifting monsoons, the reorganization of long-distance trade systems that had taken centuries to build. The people who faced these forces were not stupid or negligent or weak. They were people doing what people always do, living their lives, maintaining their systems, worshipping their gods, feeding their children, and hoping that tomorrow would look more or less like today. Sometimes tomorrow does not look like today. Sometimes tomorrow brings something that no amount of intelligence or preparation or social organization can fully absorb. Sometimes the dam breaks and the gardens are flooded, and the people must go somewhere else and begin again. They take with them what they can carry: skills, memories, seeds, languages, the stories of who they were and what they built, and they go. And the city stays behind, and the roots work into the stones, and the sand drifts over the bricks, and the jungle closes in, and centuries pass, and then, one day, someone comes looking. They come with new instruments and old questions, with satellite images and ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR beams fired from aircraft, with shovels and brushes and the careful patience of people who understand that the past does not yield quickly. They come with the same impulse that drove the people who built the cities in the first place. The impulse to understand, to make sense of what was left, to hear through the silence whatever the stones are willing to say, and the stones, in their way, speak. Not in the language of the people who cut and placed them. That language is often gone, or only partially recovered, or encoded in scripts that have not yet yielded their secrets. They speak in the language of form and material and placement, in the alignment of a doorway with the winter solstice sunrise, in the angle of a drainage channel, in the standardized dimensions of a mud brick, in the way a wall curves to follow the contour of a mountain or to enclose a sacred space. They speak of people who looked at the world and saw patterns in it, patterns of sky and season and water and stone, and built their understanding of those patterns into the things they made, so that even after the people were gone, the patterns remained, waiting to be read. This is what the lost cities are, finally. They are not monuments to failure or symbols of civilizational hubris. They are conversations, long, complex, partially legible conversations between human beings and the world they inhabited, between the generations who built and the generations who inherited and the generations who ultimately left, and between all of those people and the people who come thousands of years later and try to understand what was said. The conversation is ongoing. New tools and new methods reveal new details. New questions change what we see when we look at the old evidence. Lost cities are found. Cities thought to be known are revealed to be far larger, far more complex, far more connected than anyone had suspected. The jungle still holds its secrets. The sand still drifts over undiscovered ruins. The sea floor still covers what the sea has covered, and the deep archive of the earth has not been fully opened. There are cities out there that no modern person has ever seen, that no instrument has yet reached, that wait in the darkness of jungle or desert or ocean floor for the right question and the right tool and the right moment of discovery. And when they are found, some of them, in their time, they will add new voices to the conversation, new evidence for the extraordinary and fragile and persistent fact of human civilization, new reasons to look at the stones and listen for what they are trying to say. The cities wait, and in their waiting, they remind us of something important, that every civilization that has ever existed believed in some deep and unexamined way that it would go on, that the life being lived, the temples being built, the crops being planted, the children being raised, all of it would continue, in more or less recognizable form into an indefinite future. The cities are a record of that belief, and they are also, each in their own way, a gentle and persistent correction of it. Nothing lasts forever, but the longing to build something that might, that generative, restless, irrepressible human longing, lasts as long as there are people to feel it. And so we build and we leave, and what we build remains, and someone else comes to look at it, and the story goes on. This is not a tragedy. It is, looked at whole, something closer to a kind of wonder. The wonder of a species that cannot stop making things, even in the knowledge that making things does not make them permanent. The wonder of a species that builds cities in the mountains and in the jungle and in the desert and on the edge of volcanoes, knowing that the mountain may shift and the jungle may return and the desert may expand and the volcano may wake, and builds them anyway, because the building is the point. The making is the meaning. The city is the answer to a question that the land itself seemed to be asking, and the answer rings in stone for as long as the stone endures. The stones of Machu Picchu catch the morning light on the high Andean ridge. The roots of Ta Prohm hold the stones in their grey embrace. The gateway of the sun stands alone on the Bolivian altiplano, looking at nothing and everything. The carved walls of Angkor Wat glow in the late afternoon. The basalt columns of Great Zimbabwe cast their shadows on the savanna grass. Monk's Mound rises above the Illinois plain, patient and enormous, remembering nothing and containing everything. The lost cities are here. They have always been here. We are only just learning again and again to look.